So before we get started, I just want to say first and foremost that most of the points that I'm covering in this presentation are covered in text format in a Monero Stack Exchange answer I gave, which I'll post a link to in the description. And naturally, reading's going to be a lot quicker to process than listening to an hour of my boorish droning voice. So if you prefer the basically quicker way, I'd suggest checking that out and skipping the video. But if you do, for whatever reason, want to listen in on this presentation, let's continue. And I should also state that I am speaking as myself. I'm not trying to, do a PR piece for the Monero community at large, and I'm not speaking for them, just speaking on my individual thoughts on MoneroV. Hello, my name is Scott. I go by the alias XMR Scott on Reddit and IRC. And the reason why I have XMR Scott is because I want people to be aware when I'm talking on Reddit that I am a member of the Monero community, not because, I don't know, wear it on my sleeve per se for the sake of, hey, look at me, I'm a Monero community member, so much as to make people aware of potential biases that I have and to call me out, right? Because they're going to be more observant about things that I say. If I'm, pro Monero and I have XMR in my name, right? So if you have anything that you feel in this presentation that I am biased about or that is wrong, feel free to call me out in the comments or, send me a Reddit message. Obviously be constructive. Constructive criticism is the best. And I will try to correct it via annotations or video description or be like, yeah, I was wrong on that. Sorry about that. Because ultimately, right, I'm trying to seek the truth, and Monero is a cool technology, or I should say, I guess, set of technologies. But at the end of the day, what I value most is privacy, and I consider myself more of a privacy enthusiast than a Monero enthusiast, right? If something better comes along than Monero, or I should say that I believe is better than Monero, I have no issue switching to using that as my primary means of paying for goods and services. So that brings us to topics. So we are going to be focusing on things that MoneroV highlights on its website that basically involve comparing itself against Monero, obviously because it's a fork of Monero. And MoneroV on their website highlights inflation and scalability, and we'll be covering privacy because it's extremely important, and unfortunately MoneroV doesn't really talk much about it. And then I'll be showing kind of an interesting red flag that isn't necessarily objective and is more kind of subjective analysis. And if you have other red flags, feel free to look for them. But the idea is to kind of show you maybe perhaps how you might look for a red flag. And then we'll be doing some myth busting. So there are things that I've seen on the forums and on the interwebs that are pretty much flat out wrong, or that I take issue with that I don't feel like are addressed in some fashion, or just otherwise notable. So as I kind of mentioned before, Monero on their, or I should say MoneroV, says they're different from Monero on their website in the following fashion. MoneroV has limited supply of coins, while Monero's coin supply is infinite, and MoneroV will implement new protocols that solve the scaling problems facing Monero and other cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin. Excuse me. You can read more detail in the MoneroV roadmap. So let's focus first on coin supply, the first thing that MoneroV highlights on the website in that difference description. So this is taken from MoneroV's roadmap paper. Bitcoin's 21 million maximum coin supply was introduced specifically to avoid having a body that controls money supply, completely restricting future inflation and devaluation of Bitcoin coins. Based on this merit alone, Monero would never be able to compete with Bitcoin as the world's best digital currency, since the idea of infinite coin supply is the incorrect intuition. MoneroV adheres to core Austrian School of Economics principles and caps the total amount of MoneroV coins that can be created to 256 million. The initial coin amount in circulation at the time of the hard fork would be 10 times the amount of Monero coins, or roughly 158 million MoneroV coins. Monero holders prior to the hard fork will receive 10 times the amount of MoneroV coins. And so I've highlighted kind of the elements of this that are going to be interest for us in this presentation. So MoneroV has particular concern with basically supply and completely restricting future inflation and devaluation of Bitcoin coins. Now, while having a kind of hard cap on coin supply may restrict future inflation, it's worth noting that it doesn't necessarily affect devaluation, right? Basic economic theory about supply and demand and scarcity. If supply is held constant, basically you've mined all of your coins, and we're assuming no one's losing them, and demand diminishes, and then your coins are going to devalue. So there's issues there, but we're going to be focusing on other issues. Mainly the issue of coin supply. In the beginning, you have, as we said before, 10 times the MoneroV that you would Monero, so instantly you're inflating it by basically 10x or 1,000%, which is interesting. And if you continue to see what the coin supply trend is, according to their website, by 2067, all the MoneroV will be mined, and as we said before, it'll be 256 million. So where will Monero be in 2067? Well, we can find this out pretty easily. Monero will have basically all of the initial coins will be mined in the year 2022, roughly. It'll be about 18.4 million. From there on, Monero has what's known as a tail emission. So it's basically coins that are it's basically a block reward for the miners to keep them incentivized, and we'll get into that later. But the way it works out is there's 0.6 Monero for every block, and every block, of course, is mined every 2 minutes. So this works out to 0.3 Monero per minute. If we try and calculate the annual tail emission from this, we basically get 157,000 roughly coins a year. And if we take x, where x is the number of years after 2022, 67 minus 22 gives us 45, plug that into x, and that's how we get our 25 million from Monero. So we can then also take this formula and figure out, well, when will Monero's coin supply finally inflate to the levels of MoneroV? And we basically set the formula equal to 256 million, solve for x, and this gives us roughly 1,500 years. Or if you want to think more in terms of now versus then, it'll be in the year 3,527 AD. So as we can see here, while Monero technically has an infinite coin supply insofar as that the tail emission in theory will go on forever and ever at 0.6 Monero every block, it still takes Monero 1,500 years to catch up to MoneroV's inflation. And it's worth noting that Monero's inflation in the year 3,527 AD and tail emission inflation will be 0.06%, and this will continue to approach zero in terms of annual inflation percentage, because as the coin supply increases, that 157,000 is going to be smaller and a smaller chunk relative to the total coin supply. And so basically kind of the value that we're showing that MoneroV kind of contradicts is they're against coin devaluation, but they inflate it so much that the coin that they're comparing against, and they're claiming, you know, it's so horrible that Monero has this inflation, it takes a really long time for Monero to catch up to MoneroV in terms of inflation caused by coin supply. So why is MoneroV inflating their coin supply so drastically compared to Monero if MoneroV claims they hate coin devaluation caused by inflation in their roadmap? Well, later on in their roadmap, they say it is necessary to differentiate the two cryptocurrencies while making the two cryptocurrency wallets, MoneroV's and Monero's, to reject one another's blockchain. So what they're saying here is, right, in order to execute a chain split, you have to implement a protocol that's different enough that it's rejected by what we'll just refer to as the parent chain, in this case Monero. Excuse me. And so one of the ways MoneroV is trying to do this is by inflation, even though it violates one of their, you know, core tenets of, you know, whatever philosophy they're trying to put behind their coin. And there's no really good reason to do this, as you know, I'm sure people who are familiar with cryptocurrency are aware. You don't need to chain split a coin in order to, you know, fork a coin from another coin. MoneroV can just as easily, and arguably more easily, because they can more easily create a test net and so forth, create their own blockchain by starting with what's known as a genesis block. So they basically start their blockchain from scratch rather than copying Monero's up until March 2018. So just to reiterate, there is no good reason for MoneroV to inflate their coin supply because there are other ways to create a blockchain that better align with their views, right? If they wanted a coin cap supply of 18.4 million, they could do that. They don't need 256 million coins in their coin supply. So it's kind of rather silly in my opinion. And then they doubled down on this. And then we get to this interesting part. So MoneroV, roughly around March 6th, morning of, updated their FAQ with this following section. I've read confusing arguments about MoneroV's finite supply surpassing Monero supply soon. The claims you've seen did not factor in the percentages and the proportional distribution. To start with, every Monero holder receives 10 times the amount in MoneroV. Because this is an even distribution, the purchasing value stays the same and there's no inflation. Afterwards, the inflation of both coins is exactly the same percentage-wise until MoneroV hits 256 million, around which point Monero would be around 25.6 million, and after that point MoneroV will stop inflating as it hit the max supply, while Monero will keep inflating indefinitely. So there's a couple of interesting points to kind of deconstruct here. Mainly that for some reason MoneroV considers increasing the coin supply via basically coin emission inflation, but it doesn't consider increasing the coin supply by 10x inflation. And then the second bit that's really interesting here is kind of the second and third line, where it says, because this is an even distribution, the purchasing value stays the same and there is no inflation. So in the same sentence, they're kind of describing inflation and claiming no inflation. So what do I mean by this exactly? So let's say you start out with 10 MoneroV with a purchasing power of $100. Now, let's assume the claim that basically your purchasing power stays the same, but the supply that you control increases by 10x. So now you have 100 MoneroV, and you still have a purchasing power of 100. So what does this mean exactly happens to the coin? Well, it's simple math, really, right? 100 divided by 10 coins means each coin is worth $10. $100 divided by 100 MoneroV coins means each coin is worth $1. And so this is basically the devaluation of coin, correct? Right? So for each individual unit of MoneroV, what's happening is by increasing the coin supply 10x, even though everyone increases their supply that they control by 10x, the value of each individual unit of MoneroV is decreased, right? And this is kind of the core issue with the point that I'm trying to drive home with coin supply. They basically claim that coin devaluation through inflation is an issue, but right off the bat, they're increasing it by 10x, which inversely, assuming, as I've said before, supply, or not supply, but demand and everything else is held constant, means effectively your purchasing power for each individual coin is going to decrease to basically 1/10 of what it is. Alright, so now you might be wondering why Monero has a tail emission in the first place, and it basically boils down to Monero uses what's known as a dynamic or adaptive block size. Now, a lot of cryptocurrencies use what's known as a fixed block size, which means the blocks that miners create only can be a certain size, and therefore they can only fit a certain amount of transactions inside them. And the miner, being financially motivated, is going to include transactions that net him the most profit because they pay the most transaction fees to the miner. And so, as you can kind of see here, transaction 8 is likely not going to be included in this block that can only fit 7 transactions because transaction 8 has the lowest fee. So the miner is going to include the biggest fees. And so what you have here is you have transaction fees, and then the miners are also going to have basically a block reward for every block they mine up until, you know, all of the coins are mined if there's no tail emission. So in order to kind of understand then how tail emission works, it basically provides financial incentive for the miners to keep creating blocks and keep mining and securing the chain, because it's basically still going to be a block reward that's guaranteed for every block. And why this is important is because for dynamic block sizes such as Monero's, you have a kind of supply versus demand issue that can play out, that can collapse the currency if there's no tail emission. And how this works is basically, let's assume that the block size can increase basically to effectively infinite. What happens is, because there's no scarcity in terms of how many transactions can fit in a block, the fees are going to trend towards 0, and also in part because of miner competition. So basically, miners' only source of revenue if you don't have a tail emission is going to be fees that are basically going to approach 0. So there will be a certain point where it becomes no longer really financially viable for any miner to mine, because the math doesn't work out. And so basically the security of the cryptocurrency collapses. And so that's why a tail emission is necessary. And MoneroV doesn't really address this in their roadmap or paper, and they just really cite, you know, the Bitcoin paper, which doesn't really consider dynamic block size. So that then brings us to the other issue that MoneroV raises on their website and their roadmap as well, which is scalability. Basically, I'm not going to read the full text this time because it's a lot easier to explain, but basically Monero currently has a transaction size that's about 50 times what you'd have on Bitcoin. So naturally, as time progresses and demand ramps up, the blockchain is going to, scale a lot, not scale, but increase a lot more than Bitcoin, assuming, demand is the same, because the transactions are bigger in size. So MoneroV plans to basically solve this issues by using what's known as a Mimblewimble protocol. Now, this is an interesting protocol, and there are other people implementing it and who actually have code that's publicly audible, and they actually have a test networking grin. And if you actually check the Monero community is actually, I would say, pretty positive on this protocol, and they have no real hard feelings against Grin and wish them the best of luck. And so MoneroV plans to use this protocol, even though there's no demonstrable effort towards this end in GitHub because they haven't posted their code for that. But this comes with several problems in terms of intermittent issues. So because MoneroV is chain splitting from Monero, they inherit all the issues they claim Monero has. So for starters, MoneroV gets to inherit the 33 gigabyte Monero blockchain. They inherit the 13 kilobyte transaction size. That's 50 times Bitcoins. And the best estimate they give, or that they have, they say, and they even admit that this is kind of somewhat of an ambitious timeline, is they will integrate Mimblewimble in Q4 2019. And as I said earlier, there's no real demonstrable efforts to show that this is obtainable by the programmers because there's no code to audit. Of course, we'll post the code in public and we'll see if it's really obtainable. But again, as we'll cover in another slide in kind of the red flag section, this seems to be unlikely. So that's a bit more subjective, but the objective things here are inherits a 33 gigabyte Monero blockchain and inherits large transaction sizes despite claiming hating bloat. And there's a really easy way to avoid inheriting all this bloat from Monero, and I'm guessing you can probably guess what it is. It is, don't do a chain split. Create your own Genesis block and create your blockchain from scratch, and then you start with 0 gigabyte blockchain. Or an even arguably better way to do this is to basically do an initial coin offering, right? And so with an initial coin offering, although I'm not really a big fan of them, MoneroV seems to have no issues with doing what amounts to a pre-mine for the funding if you read the roadmap paper, and controlling almost 6% of the total coin supply. So I don't think they'd have any issues with initial coin offering for getting funding. But what that would do, the initial coin offering, would be it would allow for them to develop the Mimblewimble protocol and not build up a actual blockchain. And then when they do have the technology and it's all nice and lightweight, you can basically trade out your tokens for the actual real deal. And it's also worth noting here that Monero is aware of this issue, and the Monero community doesn't really hide from the scalability issue. And if you watch Fluffy Pony's videos or Justin's videos, when we talk about issues with Monero, this is one that we tend to highlight. And so, of course, this is one of the bigger concerns, and we're addressing it. So we have what's known as bulletproofs, which will basically cut down the transaction size by roughly 80%. So instead of being like 50x Bitcoin, it will be 10x Bitcoin, which is a nice ramp down in terms of transaction size. And obviously the Monero community will continue to look at scalability solutions. And the great thing about this is the code's already published and it's working in the test net. So if you want to, you can already test. One of the ways Monero is already addressing scalability issue. And you can't really do that with MoneroV. It's just writing on the wall, unfortunately, at this point. And then we come to privacy. So in order to understand how the privacy works, you have to have kind of at least a basic understanding of how Ring confidential transactions give you privacy. And the way it works is this, at a very basic 101 level. You have what's known as a ring signature, and you have your input, and then you basically, or I should say, the client selects 4 other decoys. And so anyone looking at the blockchain can't really tell necessarily which one is the genuine transaction. And how you prevent double spends in this scenario, because then the question becomes, if no one else on the blockchain can, tell which is the real one, how do you prevent people from spending the money twice? Well, you basically use what's known as a key image, which is, you can think of as basically a hash of the actual the actual input being used. And so if someone has 2 key images, and that means they're basically 2 key images that are the same, that means they are trying to double spend, and that will that's basically no good. So that's how you determine double spend. Pretty simple, I think. But if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. So then the question is, well, how does this play into this MoneroV attack on privacy that I read about? And the way it works is this. So as I said before, the key image is created based on the actual input that's in the ring signature. And so the key image generated will be the same if you use the same input. And so basically how an attacker would basically figure out with pretty much 100% reliability what the real transaction is in a real signature is going to basically, they scan Monero blockchain for a key images, and they will scan the MoneroV blockchain for key images. And if they find matches, that means that the same input was used. And so if we look at both those respective transactions on their respective blockchains and we do a cross compare, if there's only one transaction that is the same, across both blockchains, so in this case the transaction that I've highlighted in red, then we know with 100% reliability that that is the actual real input. And so we know all the 4 other transactions, or 12, 13, whatever, if there's only one repeated transaction, that is the genuine transaction. And so that also presents another issue. So not only are you now, for the person who double spends on that input on both chains, not only are they basically revealing with 100% reliability their real input, it has basically kind of a snowball effect on other people. So if other people select your input as a decoy in their own transaction, we can discard it, or anyone looking at the blockchain, right? Because we can tell that it's already been spent. We know that this is a decoy, and so rather than have a ring size of 5, it's now reduced to 4. And you can basically imagine if there are enough people who spend and claim their MoneroV, and they also spend it on the Monero blockchain, there will be enough transactions that where the input the real input transaction, or the real input is identifiable, and then we can remove that when looking at other transactions that use it as a decoy. So some may be 4, some may be 3, some may be 2, and some may have 1, and some may have 0 identifiable decoys. And so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. But it's worth noting that MoneroV actually attacks its own privacy more so than Monero. And you might be wondering, how is this possible, right? And it's really quite simple. So because of, how basically the adoption of MoneroV is going to be theoretically, right? Most of the MoneroV transactions are not going to be, kind of more so general transactions of people buying goods and services. Odds are it's going to be people claiming their MoneroV and trying to cash out. And so you won't have this protection of a really large transaction pool. So because you have a relatively small transaction pool for MoneroV, and the majority are likely to be transactions that basically compromise other transactions, it's going to be much more catastrophic for MoneroV potentially than Monero, because Monero is accepted in a lot more places, and you have a lot more people buying legal goods and services within this transaction pool. And this brings us to kind of another issue and kind of the real conflict of this for MoneroV, and why this point really drives it home that it's a scam, I think. So when people have raised this issue to Telegram, the Telegram group, the official Telegram group, one of the admins, who goes by GIMO, basically has said, not once but twice, and probably elsewhere, MoneroV isn't here to harm, but to create a better decentralized privacy coin which is finite. So the key phrase in there is MoneroV isn't here to harm. And as we've demonstrated pretty much objectively, MoneroV not only harms Monero and MoneroV itself, but it's going to harm MoneroV more so than it is Monero. And so it's also worth noting that, as I said before, they recently updated the FAQ, and there's nothing on that page, and I've archived it for reference here, that really talks to this privacy issue. But they've updated to talk about the inflation issue, even though their answer has significant flaws and further shows that MoneroV is likely a scam. There's nothing about the primary point that Monero community keeps raising, which is the privacy. And so this kind of leaves, there are kind of basically two outcomes for MoneroV, or two paths between whenever the idea was created for MoneroV to create it and where we are now. So the people behind MoneroV knew about this privacy issue that would be caused by a chain split before the Monero community realized it themselves, and it seems like they're claiming that they tried to raise this issue to the devs of the Monero community, and they were lulled that or whatever. But then you have to realize, so let's say MoneroV knows about it before the Monero community, and they're trying to quote raise privacy issues by doing this chain split. They are still proceeding with hurting their own users, and there are a lot more arguably better ways to raise awareness. For example, Monero has basically a vulnerability disclosure process, and you can basically get paid if you expose a vulnerability within basically a means that is ethically responsible. And if you look at the history of basically the vulnerability disclosure history, there's nothing to suggest that they did it. Now, it's possible they did it via like IRC, or they PM'd someone on Reddit, but at the end of the day, it's kind of irrelevant because they're still hurting their own users. So they're trying to prove a point by hurting their own users. They aren't really addressing this issue or talking about it at all in their roadmap. They aren't talking at all about their website. So if they're not talking about it on their website or their roadmap, how exactly is that an issue that's of genuine concern? You're just letting the Monero community escalate it for you, and it seems the Monero community is really the only community between the two that cares about this issue. And then, of course, there is the other path, which is MoneroV didn't know about it before Monero. So the Monero community, when they learned about MoneroV doing a chain split, they're processing, all right, what are going to be the negative consequences of this? And they realize, oh crap, they're kind of undermining Ring confidential transactions. So MoneroV is now, in this particular path, ignorant of the damage they're doing. And to be fair, this wasn't a corner case that Monero community necessarily considered either. But Monero isn't the one executing the chain split, right? The chain split is being executed by the MoneroV dev team, effectively. And they are still proceeding to hurt their users. So again, it's basically kind of, this comic illustrates, MoneroV is kind of shoving a stick in their bike while they're driving, and basically complaining about an issue they themselves created that can be avoided by, again, as I've said in other slides, creating a new blockchain from Genesis. And you wouldn't be hurting your own issues, and you wouldn't be contradicting the fact that you claim that you're here to do no harm. So then, if you're a Monero user, the question then becomes, how do you protect yourself against MoneroV? Well, one of the easiest ways that's within your agency is not to claim MoneroV, because there's a good likelihood that if you claim both, or not claim both, but if you claim MoneroV, you're going to compromise basically your input and give away what inputs are the decoys. You can also refrain from purchasing legal goods and services basically for a week during the MoneroV release of their client. And I think it's worth pointing out that even if they take a snapshot, the damage isn't really going to start happening until the client is released for MoneroV and people start trying to claim it and cash out and use their inputs. And it arguably even then isn't going to really happen unless an exchange offers it, in my opinion, because if you can't really spend your MoneroV anywhere because if there's no adoption of it, then you're not going to really make any transactions, and if you're not going to make any transactions, then you are undermining the privacy of MoneroV. So biggest point that you don't want to really use Monero is when MoneroV releases the client, or MoneroV is accepted on exchange. And there are a couple of other things that Justin, aka Samsung Galaxy Player, covers in the video that I'm going to link in the description. And you should definitely watch that video because he gives a much more in-depth description of all the corner cases and so forth. But these are kind of the key points, in my opinion, of stuff that's within your agency. So what have we covered? Well, we have explained how MoneroV claims devaluation of coins via inflation of coin supply is an issue to them. But they violate that because they drastically increase their coin supply, and the coin that they're comparing themselves against, Monero, doesn't catch up in coin supply, even though it has a technically infinite coin supply until roughly the year 3500. So there's a lot of intellectual dishonesty, and it's a solid kind of mark against them being a scam because they're violating a core tenet of the philosophy behind their coin. Then we have the issue of scalability. They claim they hate bloat, but they're okay with inheriting a 33 gigabyte blockchain, and they're also okay with inheriting transactions that are 50x bitcoins, even though they seem to hate them. And then lastly, privacy. They numerous times have claimed they have no intention to harm, and they proceed to harm their own users. Right? So these are all really solid, strong contradictions within the own philosophy behind their coin, and because basically they're contradicting themselves on their core values, and there's really no way to refute this. It's a pretty good bet that it's a scam. And you know, there are other red flags that we'll cover in the next slide or two. And how can MoneroV avoid all these conflicts that they create within their own philosophy? It's really simple. Don't do a chain split. As I've said before, they just need to create a new blockchain, and that will solve most of the problems. They can arguably do a little bit better by doing initial coin offering in terms of if scalability is a really big issue to them, that they don't want to really have a blockchain until Wimble's in place. But basically, again, it boils down to they shouldn't do a chain split if they don't want to contradict themselves. But odds are that's probably not going to happen. And it's worth noting here, just for the sake of my contacting them, I basically, as you can see here, relayed the three issues that I've raised: inflation, scalability, and privacy, to their team at MoneroV.org email. And this was sent at roughly early morning of March the 3rd, so roughly 3 days ago. To date, they haven't answered me. In fact, they blocked me from their Twitter account, even though I made basically 2 tweets kind of illustrating more so the privacy point. I didn't call them idiots, I didn't call them retards, I just said, hey, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot here if you do this. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And then 2 weeks later, I guess they decided to randomly block me. So they don't really seem to be having an interest in having an intellectually honest conversation. This is arguably more prevalent elsewhere, like in the Reddit forums, so they can argue, you know, Monero community is brigading, but the thing is, the MoneroV community has not answered the primary issue that the Monero community keeps nailing home, which is the privacy issue. And until they can address that, Monero community has a very, very valid concern. So we'll see how that plays out. I'm skeptical that MoneroV's community will ever answer the privacy question, really, other than just say, lol, deal with it, and then proceed to, you know, attack MoneroV's own users. So I covered some what I believe are really strong examples of MoneroV being a scam because it's self-contradictory. There are a bunch of other red flags that you can find with this project. I've highlighted one. These are arguably more subjective in nature because they're more weak, and they boil down more to subjective analysis than anything else, because there's a lot more plausible devil's advocate that you can play. So for example, in this case, in their roadmap, they claim we have brought many expert developers on board, And if you look at their GitHub, where they have posted whatever code they've decided to post, the only code they have posted is their basically blockchain explorer that you can use in a browser. The problem with this, and the reason why it's a red flag, is it's obviously a fork of the existing Monero blockchain explorer, and they've taken basically 22 commits to make some very, very basic changes. So speaking as a programmer, there really shouldn't be that many commits for relatively trivial changes. But what's probably the biggest point of interest in this red flag is the commit history of the 4 people. So at the time of this video, there are 4 pseudonyms. So there could be actually 4 distinct users. There could be 1 actual user. We can't actually reliably say, in my opinion, at this point. But what we can say is that one of the committers, by the alias NoSpawn, the last commit they made of anything, so not even just MoneroV's repositories, but just repositories in general, was February 18th. Van Factory, the last commit was March 2nd, but prior to that, the last commit they made was February 16th. Excuse me. Instance Me, the previous commit they made was February 9th. Milton F, who is also a name that we see within the Reddit moderators and one of the initial moderators of the Reddit community, is February 18th. So we can see right now it is, well, technically it's my time, it is March 7th, but there hasn't really been much activity from any of these accounts. And if you would expect that if they're working on releasing the client, there would be more activity than basically no activity in the last 2 weeks. So this is kind of an interesting red flag. And the reason why I say it's a red flag and it's subjective is, you know, if I were to play devil's advocate, I could say, well, they do say there are many experts, developers on board, right? They may have more than 4 that are making commits, and they just didn't happen to make commits to the blockchain explorer, but they're making plenty of commits and work on the actual client. So that's that. So these are the kind of red flags you can look for. There's plenty of others, and I kind of leave it as an exercise to the viewer to feel free to hunt down other ones. To me, it's kind of fun to, you know, hunt down red flags and highlight them for what it's worth. And so now we get to the myth busting section. So why does Monero community hate competition, right? This is kind of somewhat of a just disingenuous comment from one of the admins again in the Telegram group. Quote, they will not support any competition to their coin. This is actually pretty demonstratively false. I mean, I can say myself that I have no problem with, you know, other privacy coins that are actually, you know, doing valuable work, and they don't really have any flags that show they're scams. So some good examples are going to be Grin, excuse me, and Aeon. And of course, I mean, I can say that, but what about other contributors? And Diego, aka Rayrar, has said this on, you know, a competitor's quote forum. I want competition in the space. It makes privacy as a whole better with innovation. I consider myself a privacy advocate, not a Monero advocate. I welcome competition to Monero, but I just want it to be good. And right, and I think, speaking for myself again, that's basically the mindset that I have and that I tend to get from the other contributors, right? Competition is good because it kind of forces innovation to a certain degree. And because everything is open source, you know, we can, within the boundaries of licenses, you know, take things from this or that. that we didn't have if we believe it's valuable. But in general, right, we want to see other people create other innovative things that we didn't think about, because at the end of the day, we're all kind of, I think, shooting for the same end goal, which is improving the privacy of the world effectively, and how potentially the world does commerce, in terms of, basic financial transactions that make up our everyday lives. And, again, these are all kind of words, so actions speak louder than the words. So I think this is particularly illustrating case of why Monero hates other competition is demonstratively false. Is Smooth, who is a Monero core team member, has been Aeon's lead developer since April 2015. And if you're unfamiliar with Aeon is another community that Monero really has no beef with, because it's a genuine, by pretty much all accounts, crypto note based currency. There's no red flags of scams and so forth. It's the key thing worth noting about Aeon is that it has pruning, and you can go and research Aeon in your own time, but it's just worth noting that a core team member of Monero is working on a competitor's quote-unquote coin, and they've been doing that for several years now. So the argument the Monero community at large hates competition really is disingenuous, because we value competition, so long as it's good and it's not a scam, right? The Monero community calls you out on something, odds are you're probably doing something sketchy, and the only defense you have is, you just hate us because we're competition, because you can't actually provide any counter arguments. And this is something that the MoneroV community tends to do on the social forums, right? You've seen tweets, you may see it on the ANN thread, Bitcoin Talk, just, concern trolling, fudding, but there are no counter arguments to the issues raised with MoneroV, which is unfortunate, because it would be interesting to see MoneroV turn out to be an interesting project, because they actually implement Mimblewimble and they actually create their coin in a responsible way, but they're not going to be doing that from what we've seen, because we're almost a week out from the fork. So another myth is, if I use a temporary wallet to claim MoneroV coins, am I still private? And the answer, in order to understand the answer, we have to kind of explain what this question is asking. So the question is asking, let's say I have 1,000 Monero in one wallet. I then send it to a temporary wallet, right? And then what happens is a chain split comes, and basically I say 1,000 XMR because it's going to be roughly the equivalent. I didn't put the Monero V equivalent here, but it's going to be 10,000 Monero V effectively. But you get the idea, right? This is just to show that it's mirroring. And so what happens here is, in order to claim the MoneroV wallet inputs, I have to use the same private key as the Monero wallet. And so what this issue is basically saying is, what if, let's assume, what this question is assuming is that the MoneroV developers are malicious, and they're actually going to steal your funds, or they're going to look at your wallet history, and so use a temporary wallet to kind of avoid those threats. And how that works is, before you claim your MoneroV, you move your Monero from your temporary wallet back to your original Monero wallet, or to another temporary wallet, and then basically you move it wherever you want. But the end takeaway is that you are moving it before you use your keys in the MoneroV wallet. So if the MoneroV developers steal your keys, there's no funds left in your Monero wallet to move and steal. So then once you've claimed your Monero, you can basically move your MoneroV to a wallet that you trust. But this only addresses the issue of developers stealing your funds. It does not address the issue of ring signatures being undermined through basically duplicate key images. So your privacy is still going to be affected if you claim the MoneroV coins, or if in general if people claim them, you have the potential to be affected to some degree. It may not undermine your ring signature completely, just a little bit, or it may remove all the decoys. And for the numbers and the math, again, encourage you to check out Justin's video because he does a really solid job of explaining it. But again, the key takeaway is it does not keep you private if you claim your MoneroV. And lastly, we have this kind of myth that the developers are anonymous because they don't disclose their name on their website or really anywhere else. And because of that, there's no legal recourse that can be taken against them if they pull an exit scam or some other means of legally enforceable fraud, like, you know, Monero Gold. And this is based on the assumption that, you know, somehow omitting your name grants you total anonymity, when this is really false, because there's plenty of things that state level actors can do, especially, and that private individuals can do as well to de-anonymize someone if they want to. And in this case, I don't really claim to be an amazing internet sleuth, but I was able to figure out some of the identities behind the people of the MoneroV team. For example, the first person I looked at, I was able to get their real-world identity within roughly 20 minutes, I want to say, and collect a substantial amount of evidence that pretty much beyond a shadow of a doubt connects them to the MoneroV project. And the reason why I did it was because, you know, MoneroV kind of defies all common sense, as I've explained through this presentation, and then they attack Monero's privacy and they attack their own privacy even more. So it really defies all common sense. And so I can say, at the very least, I think that it doesn't seem to be a collaborative effort between the world law enforcement agencies, and it's most likely just a scam and a cash grab. And so should they ever pull an exit scam or anything else that can basically be legally fined or jailed for, I will definitely be reporting it to the legal authorities privately and ethically. And should any news come of it, and their real world identity is disclosed via said court cases and public news, I can point to this kind of embedded encrypted clue that I've left behind that's relatively ambiguous and doesn't really, even if you decrypt it, it won't really give you much of anything. But it's enough to say, yeah, I knew who they were pretty much from the beginning, and just proves the point that people can be de-anonymized if they aren't really careful. And so that's pretty much it for my presentation. Thank you for willing to sit through an hour-long presentation and listen to my voice, and I hope you have a good day. Thanks for your time.